All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, Tilsim Shach of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Shir and Joshos this year as a zchus for Bisoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul Abba Leinu Latova, Bennett Goldberg, for Aliyah for the Shalom of his parents, Avram ben Asher Pinchas, Fegar Ezel, Bas Zelig, and in the hope that Amir Hashem, the Tzilos of our Kil and all of Klal Yisrael will be answered during this holy month. Shmuel and Liba Dinovitz, Lili Nishmas, David Flum's father, Rabbi Ari Flum, Rabbi Yitzchak, Aryeh ben Achavar, Rabbi Yaakov, Zichrono Livracha. Our week of learning sponsors, David Goodman, Lili Nishmas, Roi ben Aryeh, Zichrono Livracha. And our Daf Yomi sponsors, Milt and Melanie Gertner, in memory of Milt's father, Gilbert Gertner, Getzel ben Avram, Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of the Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need to refer Shavin together with Kol Chol Yisrael, Kadosh Baruch Hu should Emir Hashem bring home our hostages, B'Shalom and B'Karav, and allow our holy soldiers to be successful. B'Chol Ma'asei Yedehem. But with that, let us begin. We have a ridiculous amount of Gemara to do today, right? Just okay. But we are going to Emir Hashem get it done. We always get it done, so you can get it done. Gimel. Today's daf is daf Gimel. We're starting. I think we're starting like in Maseches Avodah Zarah. But no, we're starting on Beis Amud Beis. Beis Amud Beis on 2b, and we are picking up Emir Hashem. Emir Hashem. My Rabbi, ha'osimi piatzmo? My Rabbanon. Yeah, my Rabbanon. So we'll say, so remember again, we began, this is probably about 20 lines up from the bottom. So my Rabbanon. So we'll say, so remember again, we had a statement of the name of Rabbi Yehuda, the name of Shmuel. So Rabbi Yehuda said, Zu divrei Rabbi Yehuda, right? Rabbi Yehuda said, these are the words of the Tana, Rabbi Yehuda, Aval chachamim omrim yachid she'asa ba'oras beis din chayiv. But ultimately, so we'll say, so remember again, our entire Mishnah reflected the following view, which is that halacha l'maisa, am I about right? 20 lines off from the bottom?
Yeah, we're closer to the top.
Where did I get to?
Pretty close to the top.
10 lines from the top?
Yeah.
Come on. I did not get 10. That's embarrassing. Don't just go with me with this. 10 lines from the top?
Yeah,
okay. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Roy Laura?
Yeah.
All right. I got this. Okay. Roy Laura. So remember again. Well, what did I do yesterday? What was it? Okay. So Roy Laura. All right. We got this. Oh, now I get it. Somebody came over to me last night after Choshab Bashir. Somebody listens online. He said, Rebbe, what happened? The recording cut out in the beginning of Amud Beis. Now I get it. Okay. Got it. Okay, so Gemara says as follows. Fine. So the Mishnah says as follows. So remember again, if the halacha is that if you have a Beis Din that paskin, right? And the Beis Din went ahead and said that halacha l'maisa, they said chaylev is mutter. So remember again, then you have someone either on the Beis Din or ultimately again sitting in the galley of the Beis Din, who halacha l'maisa understands that the Beis Din is absolutely mistaken. They still act upon that ruling. Halacha l'maisa, they are not patur, they're chayv and echatos, right? Because remember again, reliance on the Beis Din's ruling only applies to someone who really doesn't know any better and puts his full trust in the Beis Din, which makes sense for a regular person. But l'maisa, someone who understands, halacha l'maisa doesn't have that exemption. So says the Gemara, Ra'ila kigon man. No, we did this. Kigon man, right? Amar, thank you. Amar Rava, Kigon Shimon ben Azai v'Shimon ben Zoma. So the Gemara gives examples of this. Like these individuals, the Shimon ben Azai, Shimon ben Zoma, the Rashi points out over here, Shahayu yoshvin lifnei chachamim v'hayu re'uyin lahora. So these individuals themselves were not dayanim, but they sat in front of the Beis Din. Also remember, back to our Sanhedrin days, that there was always like a, for lack of a better term, like a judicial bullpen, right? There were always rows of students who were there in case the Beis Din needed additional students. So these were individuals who themselves were not judges, but halacha l'maisa again were fit for hora. They were fit for hora. Therefore, halacha l'maisa again, if they were to rely on an erroneous statement of the Beis Din, they would be personally liable. Amar Abaye, one second. Ki agavna mezitu. Now, someone like that, someone like Shimon ben Azai, or Shimon ben Zoma, if they hear that the Beis Din rules that chaylev is mutar, they know that it's wrong. They know that it's an erroneous psak. If they were to rely on that psak and eat chaylev, that's amazing. That's amazing. That's intentional violation. Well, the Tamech, the Gemara says, well, using that logic, well, Tamech hadisanya ba'asosa achos. So the Gemara says, ultimately again, Yachida osa mipi atzmo chayiv, boras Beis Din pater. If an individual commits an aveira, ultimately he's chayiv b'chatos. Talking about b'shogeg. If he does so under the instruction of Beis Din, he is pater. Keitzad, what's the case? Horu Beis Din shechelev mutar v'no de le'echad mehen shetau. So this is the Mishnah, I will say. Right? So ultimately, Beis Din paskin that chelev is mutar, and one of the members of the Beis Din realizes that no, Beis Din is mistaken. Oh, Talmud Yoshev B'fnei Baray La'ara, Kigon Shia Ben Azai. Or, for example, someone's, they have a Talmud who's fit to be a judge, is sitting there in the Beis Din, and ultimately, again, he relies on the ruling. Yachol Yeh Pater. You might have thought that such a person would be Pater. Talmud Lomar Ba'asosa Achos. Yochid ha'osa pi atzmo chayiv. If an individual acts of his own volition, ultimately, again, he is chayiv. B'horaz Beis Din pater. Ultimately, again, but if he does so with the instruction of Beis Din, he's pater. So Moshe says, the problem is like this. These individuals are still acting with the instruction of Beis Din, but at the end of the day, they know better. So how does this shtim? Shabbos said, this is fascinating. So what we're asking over here is, so what is the case of a Talmid Chacham who relies on the erroneous psak of a Beis Din, right? Ultimately, again, who again knows that the Beis Din is wrong, but ultimately, again, is still called shogeg. What is that case? Shabbos said, this is fascinating. The yada da aser. He knows that it's aser. That chelev is aser. The katai, watch this. B'mitzvah l'shmoa divrei chachamim. L'didinami detah b'mitzvah l'shmoa min divrei chachamim. So I'll say this is quite interesting. What's the shogeg over here? The shogeg over here is like this. The Talmid Chacham knows that the Beis Din is wrong, but what he's not sure about is there's a biblical obligation to listen to the words of the rabbis. So he thinks to himself, oh, maybe that biblical obligation applies even in situations where it's clear that the Rabbanim are wrong. That's the shogeg of this case over here. So again, or in other words, it's not mazid because he's not intentionally, he's intentionally eating chaylev, and he knows that chaylev is aser, but his feeling is like this, that lemaisa, there's a mitzvah to listen to Chazal. So perhaps the mitzvah to listen to Chazal ultimately is even if you know they're wrong. Now, by the way, it's not a crazy assumption. What does Rashi say on the pasuk? Lo sasra min hadavar sheyagidu lecha yamin usmol. Rashi says, do not veer from the words that they tell you right or left. What does Rashi say according to the Gemara? Afilu omrim al yamin shu smol val smol shehu yamin. Even if the Beis Din tells you that the right is left and the left is right, you have to listen. So one could erroneously glean from that even if the Beis Din tells you that chaylev is mutter, but you know that chaylev is aser, that you should still listen, or you can still listen. Again, kamash malah, no, not that far. Not that far. And therefore, again, such an individual would not be shielded from personal liability. He would be chai b'chatos, but yet he's still called a shogeg, right? He's still called a shogeg, not a shogeg regarding chaylev, but a shogeg regarding ultimately the mitzvah to listen to Chazal. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Zaklal hatol b'atzmo chayiv. So we'll say, remember again, the Mishnah said, here's the rule. Any person who essentially acts of his own volition is always going to be chayiv chatos. Remember, we're talking about cases of shogeg over here. So when we say chayiv, we mean chayiv chatos, which is carbonic liability for inadvertent commission of an avera or certain averas. So again, if he acted on his own volition, he's going to be chayiv chatos. Acted as a result of the Beis Din's instruction, will be part from chatos. So tolu bebeis din lasuye horu beis din v'yadu sheto. So listen to this. V'chazru bohen. So the Gemara says tolu bebeis din. Let me give you an example of that. Beis Din paskin chaylev is mutter, and then I'll say what happened. Beis Din realized that they made a mistake. So what did they do? So they went ahead and they recanted. V'chazru bohen. But I will say, what's the problem? But Ruvain didn't hear about this. Ruvain only heard the first part, didn't hear the second part, right? So Ruvain heard that Beis Din paskin that chaylev is aser, but he did not hear. Sorry, chaylev is mutter, but he did not hear that they recanted that psak. So he acted on it. Someone says, so of course he's going to be pater. Someone says, ha behedra katani la. Tani v'hader mefarish. You're right. The Gemara says, you're right. First, the Mishnah went ahead and first the Mishnah says the case, and then the Mishnah just espoused the principle. Good. I'm Rabbi Shmuel. Okay, so we'll say here's actually where we left off yesterday. The rest is just Chazara. I'm Rabbi Shmuel, right? Zu divrei Rabbi Huda. So the Gemara now says like this. All of this up until now, right? So we've been operating with one core principle, which is when Beis Din paskins and makes an erroneous psak, an erroneous ruling, and an individual relies on that ruling and acts accordingly, the individual is pater. He is shielded from personal liability because he acted ultimately, again, under the instruction of the Beis Din. That's what we're operating. Now, and we'll say, up until this Gemara right now, we have assumed everyone agrees with that statement. Comes on review, says in Shmuel, this idea, zu div Rabbi Huda. That's Rabbi Huda. The Chum say Yachid Shasabaraz Beis Din Chayiv. Ooh, the Chum say natural. Not true. When an individual acts, even though he's acting under the instruction of Beis Din, at the end of the day, he is chayiv. There is personal liability even when you act under the instruction of Beis Din. And therefore, again, just plugging this in, Beis Din says chaylev is mutter. Reuven goes out and purchases himself a nice zaftig piece of chaylev, right? And that's dinner. Chacham are going to say he's liable. Chatos, because again, it's shogeg. To be clear, it's not mezid, it's shogeg, but there's still going to be liability. The Gemara says, okay, let's unpack this. So essentially now what we have over here is a machlokes Tanur Rabbi Huda and the Chacham. Rabbi Huda says, individual acts based on the psak of Beis Din, he is pater. Chachamim say he is chayiv. So my Rabbi Huda, who's Rabbi Huda? Tisanya im nefesh achas techata b'shgaga ba'asosa hari'elu gimiutin. So if you look at this phrase im nefesh achas techata, you have essentially three limiting or exclusionary phrases. Therefore, what does this teach us? Hosimi pi'atzmo chayiv baraz Beis Din pater. If you act of your own volition and you commit an avera inadvertently, you're chayiv chatos. You do so based under the psak of the Beis Din, you're pater. So good. That's ultimately Rabbi Huda. My Rabbanon, what's the Rabbanon? The Sanya, Adayin ani Omer, miut kal shechatu, chayavin, shein Beis Din mevin al yidein par. So what's going to happen over the course of the next daf is that we're going to be kind of going back and forth with two concepts. This idea of our Mishnah, that Beis Din paskind ultimately, again, delivered an erroneous psak, individual acted on it, is there liability for an individual chatas or not? Then, as you mentioned in yesterday's daf, which is still today's daf, there is also another concept, which is par ha'elam davar min hatzibur, which means Beis Din issues an erroneous psak, and the majority of the congregation, now we're going to discuss what congregation means, but the majority of Klal Yisrael acts on that psak. Then that requires another sin offering. Who's bringing that sin offering? Is it the Beis Din? Is it Klal Yisrael? That we're going to see. That's what we're going to see. So that's the Gemara's jumping to over here for just a moment. The Sanya. Adayin ani Omer, miut kal shechadu. If only a minority of Klal Yisrael sinned based on the erroneous psak of Beis Din, chayavin. You're still, the individual members of Klal Yisrael are going to have to bring a chatas. Why? Shein Beis Din meviin al yidehen par. So interestingly enough, so the Gemara is saying over here that if only a minority of Klal Yisrael sinned, based on the psak of the Beis Din, the minority is going to have to bring a chatos. Why? Because since it's a minority, there's no par ha'elam davar min hatzibur, and therefore, again, the Klal Yisrael is not covered by that carbon. Because they're not covered by that carbon, everyone has to bring their individual chatos. Rov kal shechatu, and again, I both say, we're going to see this sugya. Right now, it's being mentioned over here. We're going to delve into par ha'elam davar min hatzibur. Rov kal shechatu, yupturin. But at the end of the day, if the majority of Klal Yisrael sinned, ultimately, again, they should be pater. You would have thought that therefore they should be pater from individual chatas liability. Why? Shari Beis Din meviin al yidein par. Because the Beis Din is going to bring up par ha'elam davar min hatzibur. Talmud lomar me'am ha'aretz. Afilu ruba va'afilu kula. Wow. Okay. So we'll say, so now watch this. The Rabbanan is saying like this. You would have thought that when there is a par ha'elam davar min hatzibur, ultimately, again, the individuals would be pater from a chatos. Kamash malon me'am ha'aretz. The am ha'aretz, the nation of the land, the individuals must always go ahead and address their personal carbonic liability. So therefore, the Rabbanan are saying, even when a par ha'elam davar tzibur is being brought, the individuals must still bring their individual chatas, which shows you what? that even where there is liability on the part of the Beis Din, and the individual is acting on behalf as a result of the instruction of the Beis Din, there is still personal carbonic liability. See, here it is, Rabbi says. So that's our machlokes. So Rabbi Yehuda says, when the individual acts under the instruction of Beis Din, no personal carbonic liability, no chatas. The Rabbanan is saying, no, even though you're acting under the instruction of the Beis Din, right, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. There is still personal carbonic liability in the form of a chatas. Incredible. So the Gemara says, the Gemara goes on with it actually. B'mai, what's the case over here? Ilema b'shigagas maisa. If we're talking about over here, that individuals just acted of their own volition, without the instruction of Beis Din, they just made a mistake. Beis Din shelo bara, the Beis Din didn't deliver a psak, then Beis Din ma'avir etayu. Ultimately, again, then obviously Beis Din has nothing to do with this. Shelo bara is Beis Din mean ma'aser shelo bara. If Beis Din never passed, we're just talking about a situation where people just made, a large group of people just made the same mistake, so obviously again it's personal liability. Ela bara, probably most of the time in a case where the Beis Din did issue an erroneous psak, v'ha ki ksiv me'ama aretz b'shigagas ma'aso dichsiv. But here's the problem, when the pasuk is me'ama aretz by the obligation of chatos, the both say lashon of shigagas ma'asa means that Klal Yisrael, whether some individuals, minority, even a majority, they're making a mistake based on their own mistaken understanding. Nothing to do with a psak of Beis Din. So this is written by Shigas Maisa. Ela lav hachikar. What it means to say. Here we go. Miut kal shechatu b'shigas Maisa. When a minority of Klal Yisrael sins of their own volition, they made a mistake. Not a psak of Beis Din. They made a mistake. Chayavin. Ultimately, again, they're chayv v'chatos. Each individual. Why? Shein Beis Din mevin. Ayidei par b'hora. Because Beis Din is not bringing a par ha'elam davra minat tzibor for them. Ha, as the Gemara says, ha hein chayavin, yachol rovat tzibor sha'asu b'shigas ma'is yupturin. You might have thought, therefore, if the majority of Klal Yisrael commits an avera, b'shigas ma'isa, of their own volition, that ultimately, again, they should be pater. Shari Beis Din mevian aleihem par bora, Talmud lomar me'arma aretz va'afilu rubo. Ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa. So ultimately, again, ma'ama aretz, even when the majority sins, when the majority sins, if it was not a horas basin, if there was no psak, ultimately, again, they're chayiv v'chatos. Amra papa, mimai, sounds like papa is why do you say that? Dilma, lo hein v'lo beis. Maybe no one brings a carbon in that circumstance. If that's the case, then why are you looking for the majority to create a sense of liability? Lav michlal. It must be because even when a minority goes ahead and acts on the psak of the Beis Din, ultimately, again, there's going to be liability as a result of the ruling. So the Gemara said, let's go ahead first, look at a case for the miyut, for a minority, that will be chayav shigas ma'is, so acted of their own volition, and then we'll find the case ultimately again of liability for the majority who acted b'shigas ma'is. Alalav midalo mahadr al miyut mechayvin b'shigas ma'isa. But rather, again, from the fact that we're not looking for a case of miyut, of minority, who are liable for their own actions. Ubasof mahadr al ruba lichuyuva b'shigas ma'isa shmamina miyut bara chayavin. When a minority ultimately acts as a result of the instruction of the Beis Din, they are going to be chayiv. Chayav kisba u'seira. That's another way of saying a carbon chatos. V'shalo bara shigas ma'isa. Ultimately, again, and when Allah L'maisa, they act even without a psak of Beis Din, ultimately, again, they will be chayav and chatos as well. Michdi. So therefore, both say, okay, bottom line, I would do a little bit quickly, but bottom line is what we're just trying to highlight what Rabbi Yehuda said. Rabbi Yehuda helped us to understand that which we thought was fully agreed upon in the Mishnah is in fact subject to machlokes. Here's the takeaway. Here's the one piece of information I want you to hold on to as we go through this incredibly beautiful yet somewhat complex journey. We have a fundamental machlokes tanoim. If an individual acts as a result of an erroneous psak of the Beis Din, is he chayiv a carbon chatas or not? Beis Din said chaylev is mutter. Reuven said, great, always wanted to have some. Goes out, eats chaylev, finds out Beis Din was wrong. Now Reuven's a shogig, obviously he acted accidentally. Is he chayiv a chatas or not? Normally, again, I will say, so just understand, had Reuven accidentally consumed a piece of chaylev, what would have been the halacha? Carbon chatos. Here, Ruvain, interestingly enough, acted based on the psak of the Beis, so he made a mistake. Isi chay v'chatas. Rabbanon, Rabbi Huda, no. The individual is shielded from personal liability when he acts as a result of the psak of the Beis. Rabbanon, yes. Just remember that machlokes. That's going to be our machlokes for today. We're going to see it play out a number of different ways. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, good. Michti, Tara Stam Mishnayos. So both the Mishnayos that you quoted, right, were both what we call Stam Mishnayos, which means without attribution. The Gemara said, Mimai de Kamais Rabbi Huda Basrais Rabbanon. How do you know the first one's Rabbi Huda and the second one's Rabbanon? The Gemara said, maybe it's just the opposite. The Gemara said, Man Shamas like the Darsh Miut. They know because who is the one who ultimately darshans a miut, that's like the me'ama aretz, ki agav. Rabbi Huda, it's Rabbi Huda the Sagya. Rabbi Huda says, well, it's the top of Gimel. Zos, Toras ha'ola hi, hare'elu shlosha miutin. So again, we'll say the Gemara darshans over here. Zos, Toras ha'ola. There are three limiting phrases or three limiting words in this. So you see, it's Rabbi Huda who darshans miutin. Therefore, it makes sense to attribute the brisa, ultimately, the Mishnah, I should say, of me'ama aretz to Rabbi Huda. And the other possibility is, Adayin ani omer lo matzis mokmos like Rabbi Huda. Perhaps I can't yet fully establish like Rabbi Huda. Diktani rov kal shechatu. So we'll say. So now again, we're jumping back now to par helam davar min hatzibur. We have not learned this sugya, but again, par helam davar min hatzibur, which literally means par, a bull offering. Helam davar min hatzibur. Something, a piece of information, has been hidden or obscured from the congregation. Represents a situation based in issued an erroneous psak, and majority of Klal Yisrael relied on it. Okay, so now watch this. Diktani, rov kal shechatu. If the majority of Klal Yisrael sinned, based in mivin al yedehen par. So based, now according to this version, based in is the one who brings the par helam davar min hatzibur. The individual doesn't bring anything. Beis Din brings this carbon on behalf of Klal Yisrael. Vi Rabbi Huda, and I will say, now watch this. If you think that this is Rabbi Huda, listen to this. Ha'amar, Sibur Huda Maisi, Beis Din lo. Okay, get ready for this. I will say, machlokes number 2 that I want you to remember. When there is a par helam davar min hatzibur, right? So Beis Din issued erroneous ruling, majority of Klal Yisrael relied on it. Now, carbonic liability, par helam davar min hatzibur. Who brings that carbon? Watch this. Tisnan. Rabbi Huda Omer. So we'll say, let me just say this outside. The Rabbanan say that ultimately, again, it is the Beis Din who brings it. Rabbi Huda is going to say, Klal Yisrael brings it. The Tzibur brings it. Now, what does that mean? The Tzibur, like there's one par for Klal Yisrael, there's multiple paros for Klal Yisrael, that we're going to see. But just again, that's machlokes number 2 to kind of keep in your head. This time, here we go. Rabbi Huda is fascinating. Rabbi Huda Omer, Shiva, I will say, I'm Gimel Amud Aleph 3a, 6 lines down from the top. This time, Rabbi Huda Omer, Shiva Shvatim Shechatu Mevi'in Zayin Parim. So listen to this. If 7 tribes, now we'll say, remember again, what does 7 tribes represent? 7 tribes represents majority of Klal Yisrael. Now, interestingly enough, not necessarily numerical majority, but tribal majority. We're going to talk about that, and so many exciting things to come. I don't know, next week when we finish this stuff. Right, so we'll say, so let me say again, right? 7 tribes, right? So 7 tribes go ahead and commit an Avera. So what's the halacha? But now again, I will say, this is all shogig, mevi'in zayin parim. Rashi points out over here, look at Rashi, last white line Rashi, zayin shvatim, tahavu rov shvatim. That's the majority of the shvatim of Klal Yisrael. Mevi'im shiva parim. So it's interesting. So obviously, 1 par per shevet. Because some Rabbi Yehuda, the shevet echad ikri kal ve'in mevi'in v'lo Beis Din. So we'll say there's a lot actually is happening over here. First of all, in Rabbi Yehuda, you see that it's the people who bring the par, not the Beis Din. And it's also interesting to see that according to Rabbi Yehuda, each shevet is considered its own kal. It's considered its own congregation, and therefore each shevet must bring its own par. Nachman Rabbi Shmuel, Sudiv Rabbi Meir. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. So we'll say, so therefore again, right now where we are is we have 2 machloksim, Rabbi Huda and the Rabbanan. Number 1 is in our Mishnah. The Rabbanan say ultimately again, Rabbi Huda says the individual is shielded from personal liability when he relies on the psak of a Beis Din. Rabbanan say no, you're liable. And machlokis number 2, bar halam davar min hatzibur. The Rabbanan say Beis Din brings it. Rabbi Huda says Klal Yisrael brings it. Nachman Rabbi Shmuel, Sudiv Rabbi Meir. These words of Rabbi Meir. Avachachamrom, the Chum say Yochid Shasa Ba'araz Beis Din Chayev. So I see, interestingly enough, Rav Nachman says it's not Rabbi Yehuda who's the opposing. It's not Rabbi Yehuda who's the Tana in our Mishnah, but rather again it's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is the one who says ultimately again the individual is shielded from personal liability when he acts on the advice of the Beis, or the psak of the Beis Din. But the Chachamim say ultimately again that he's chayiv. So the Gemara says, "My Rabbi Meir, my Rabbanon." What are these? Both these pains. The Sanya. Here we go. Horu v'asu. Beis Din paskin that chaylev is mutter, and Ruvain went out, or individuals went out and ate it. Rabbi Meir poter, Rabbi Meir says you're poter, and ultimately again Chacham say that you're chayiv. Man asu. So we'll say, what does this mean? Who is doing this? Who is performing this chait? Because if you look at Lashon the Braisa, it's very interesting. It says horu v'asu. They paskind and they ate. I'll just use chaylev as the example. So I understand the paskening is being done by the Beis Din. Who went out and committed the avera? Because also this is not singular. It's not horu v'asa, but it's horu v'asu. Who's doing this? Ilema Beis Din. So we'll say again, if it's Beis Din who paskin and Beis Din who went out and then acted, they ate the chaylev. So my time of Rabbanan the mechayvi. Ultimately, as well say, so once again, this is par helam davar minat sibor. So ultimately, again, so if it's the Beis Din that paskin and the Beis Din that went out and ate the chaylev, then why would there be liability for par helam davar minat sibor? Vatanya yachol horu Beis Din va'asu. You would have thought like this: if Beis Din went ahead and paskined, and then Beis Din themselves acted on their own psak, you might have thought that ultimately, again, there'd be liability there. Tamulomar, so in other words, par helam davar minat sibor liability. Tamulomar hakahal va'asu. No, par helam davar minat sibor is only when Beis Din paskins and Klal Yisrael acts. Maiset taloi bekal v'hora tluya bebeis din. The action is dependent on Klal Yisrael, and the psak is on the Beis Din. In other words, this is a synergistic partnership in the commission of sin. So ultimately, again, Beis Din is delivering the erroneous ruling, and Klal Yisrael are the ones who are acting on it, which indicates to us that if Beis Din issued the ruling, and then Beis Din are the ones that acted on it, there might be chatas liability, but ultimately, again, it's not par helam davar minat sibor. Ella, rather you have to say, horu Beis Din va'asu rov kal. It must be that ultimately, again, Beis Din paskind, and what happens? And what happened? And halacha l'maisa, the majority of Klal Yisrael acted upon it. So if that's the case, my tam Rabbi Meir depoter. Why would Rabbi Meir say that they're poter from par helam davar minat sibor? That's the paradigmatic case of par helam davar minat sibor. Elalav horu Beis Din. Rather, I will say what happened. Horu Beis Din va'asu miot kal. Rather, what happened over here? Beis Din paskin that chaylev is mutter. A minority of Klal Yisrael came along and acted on that psak. Okay, so now I will say, watch this. So here's machlokes. Mar savar yachid shasabaraz Beis Din pater. One opinion, namely Rabbi Meir, holds that when an individual, and by the way, I will say, you're considered an individual up until what point in time? Up until what point in time? Till it's the majority, right? In other words, there's no difference between a minority of Klal Yisrael and ultimately, again, an individual. That it's the same thing. So again, halacha l'maisa, when an individual sins, Rabbi Meir holds, when he does so based on the psak of the Beis Din, he's going to be pater. Umar savar, the Chachamim on the other hand hold, yachid shasa baraz Beis Din chayiv. Now, even when an individual acts based on the instruction of the Beis Din, he's still going to be chayiv a personal chata. So we'll say, this is our machlokes. So again, we're just reframing it. Before we said the machlokes was Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. Now again, the Gemara is suggesting that Rabbi Nachman is suggesting that it's Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. But it's the same machlokes. Incredible. So Amar Papa, D'chuli Alma, Papa disagrees. He says, D'chuli Alma yachad shasa baraz Beis Din pater. Not true. Let's say everyone agrees that when an individual acts based on the psak of the Beis Din, that he is going to be pater. He does not have personal liability. No chatas liability in that case. All right, so what's the machlokes over here? This is fascinating. This is incredible, Abosai. So let's jump back now. Par helam davar minat sibor. So remember again, when do you bring par helam davar minat sibor? When do you bring it? By the way, who brings par helam davar minat sibor? Who brings it? Machlokes. Good. Little pop quiz there, right? Machlokes, right? Machlokes is it the sibor ultimately again, isn't it good? So just keep that in mind, right? And when ultimately again, when do they bring it? So now here's the news. When do they bring it? What has to happen? Majority of Klal Yisrael has to sin based on the erroneous psak of the Beis Din. So here's the machlokes. We'll say, watch this. What's the machlokes over here? Does Beis Din count towards the calculation of the majority of Klal Yisrael or not? In other words, we'll say, let's say, and again, so let's say with the Beis Din, the majority of Klal Yisrael sinned. Without the Beis Din, it's a minority. It's a big difference, right? I don't know, halacha is a big difference. So does the Beis Din themselves count in the calculation of majority? So here we go. Mar Savar Beis Din Mashal Rav Tzibor. One opinion says yes. Umar Savar Ein Beis Din Mashal Rav Tzibor. One opinion says no. Fundamental machlokas. V'bai Sema. And again, we'll say, we're going to see, like I said, this is not the sugya of par halam dava minat tzibor. The good news is when we get there, you're going to be armed with so much incredible information. It's going to be a breeze. V'bai Sema. The other possibility is haru bezin v'asu rov kal. The other possibility is we'll say what happened over here. We have a typical case. Bezin paskin. The majority of Klal Yisrael went ahead and committed the avera. Uman chacham Rabbi Shimon da amar tzibor maisi u Beis Din maisi. Wow. So apparently, both say there is a third opinion, Rabbi Shimon. So up until now, we thought it was machlokes. One opinion says Klal Yisrael brings the power. Other opinion says Beis Din brings the power. Where now there's a third opinion that says everybody brings the power. Ultimately, again, the Beis Din brings the power. Klal Yisrael brings the power. Paras for everyone. V'bai sema shevet shasu baras Beis Dino. So what's the other possibilities? What's the machlokes? We're just trying to figure out different ways to frame this machlokes. Maybe the machlokes is like this. What happens now? We'll say every shevet had their own court system as well. What happens if a shevet, an entire tribe, acts based on the advice or the halachic instruction of their particular Beis Din? So Gemara says, "Uman chachamim who are the chacham Rabbi Hudi Disanya shevet shasa baraz Beis Dino osa shevet chayiv." So this is very interesting. If a shevet went ahead and acted under the instruction of its Beis Din, the shevet will be chayiv. Okay, v'bai same. Okay, go on. Shechatu, or the other possibilities we'll say, watch this. Very interesting. Shechatu shisha vehin rubo shalkal, o shiva ava bishen rubo shalkal. Rabbi says in the following case, still part of the minat tzibor. Let's say again you have a situation where 6 tribes sinned, but they are the numerical majority of Klal Yisrael, or 7 tribes sinned, so you have the tribal majority, but what? They're not the numerical majority. What happens there? Umastisin man Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar disanya Rabbi Shimon Elazar omer mishmo chat o shisha vehin rubo shalkal o shiva afapi shein rubo shalkal chayaven. So we'll say it's actually a pasuk halacha l'maisa. We're going to see this later on that for establishing majority can be established in one of 2 ways: either numerical majority or tribal majority. Either one of those 2 will create the majority ultimately again for par halam darva minat tzibor. Incredible, I will say. Fine. Amar Ravasi, we'll say fascinating. Gemara Ravasi says, so we'll say, so again, takeaways over here, still say machlokes. Whether it's Rabbi Huda and the Chachamim or Rabbi and the Chacham, still say machlokes. Individual acts as a result of a mistaken and erroneous ruling of Beis Din. Is there individual liability for a chatas or not? Machlokes. That's our overarching machlokes. Along the way, we're picking up a lot of other pieces of information and sub-machloksim as well. Another one to keep in mind, who brings the par halam davar minat tzibor? Is it the Beis Din? Is it Klal Yisrael? Is it both? What constitutes a majority? Tribal majority, numerical majority, or both? Again, just keep all of these things in mind as we go along. This is a fascinating statement. I'm Ravasi. We'll say get ready for this. This is a wild Gemara. Now we'll say, so remember again, for par halam davar minat tzibor, on a basis of what do you need? Majority. However, we're calculating majority, numerical majority, tribal majority, but the power is only brought if the majority of Klal Yisrael sins as a result of an erroneous ruling of Beis Din. Come along, Ravasi. Ravasi says, "Ubara halach acharov yoshvei Eretz Yisrael." The majority of Jews is only calculated by, overwhelming statement, by the residents of Eretz Yisrael. The Jews of Chutz La'aretz do not count in this calculation. Shnei Amar, why is that? Shnei Amar, Vayas Shlomo Ba'is Echad. After Shlomo Melech built the Beis Hamikdash, he made a big yamtiv. V'chol Yisrael imo kal gadol, and with Shlomo Melech was a large assembly. Milevo Chamas ad Nachal Mitzrayim, from Levo Chamas until the border of Egypt, which I will say essentially are the territorial borders of Eretz Yisrael. When they celebrated for 14 days. The Gemara says, I don't understand. So I understand. It already says that all of Klal Yisrael came to celebrate with Moshe, right? Why does it then have to say a Kal Gadol, a large assembly, a large congregation, and then giving the borders from the Vo Chamas up until Mitzrayim? Why do that? Shma Mina, I'll say, watch this. Hanihu di Ikri Kal, aval Hanach lo Ikri Kal. It is only the Jews of Eretz Yisrael that are called Kahal, that are called the Assembly of Israel. The Jews outside of Eretz Yisrael are not called Kahal. So we'll say this is an incredibly and overwhelmingly striking Gemara. If you look at Rashi for just a moment, Rashi says, Halach acharov yoshrei Eretz Yisrael, the osam shebechutz haaretz eino min haminyan. It's a little bit of an abrasive statement, right? Ultimately, again, the Jews of Chutz La'aretz, ultimately, again, are not part of the tally. Not part of the tally. So we'll say, so this is a fascinating halachic concept as well. Klal Yisrael, or we should say Kahal Yisrael, is made up of the Jews of Eretz Yisrael. The Jews of Chutz La'aretz are still bona fide Jews, but we do not count towards part of Kahal Yisrael. So therefore, I will say, interestingly enough, for this purpose over here, for Parhal and Davar Minat Tzibor, majority is only calculated based on the Jews who live in Eretz Yisrael, not the Jews who live outside Eretz. We see a lot of different examples of this. For example, Yovel becomes Doraisa when Emirat Hashem Rov Yoshel, the majority of Klal Yisrael lives in Eretz Yisrael. So you see that there are certain things that only the Jews of Eretz Yisrael count towards the total tally. We'll say it's an overwhelming thing for us to contemplate, and the truth is, we feel this. We feel this. You feel when you're in Eretz Yisrael, you always feel like you are part of something bigger. That's it. The most wonderful, leaving aside anything else. Right? When you come to Eretz Yisrael, by definition, your neshama feels, I am part of something bigger than myself. The greatest challenge of Chutz La'aretz is that ultimately, again, we're proud Jews, we're happy to be a part of something beautiful, but that feeling, we could have that feeling of Kehillah, which Baruch Hashem we work very hard to create, but that feeling of Kahal, ultimately, again, it's something that is not felt in Chutz La'aretz. Kehillas Yisrael is only in Eretz Yisrael. That is only felt there. Strong, vibrant, beautiful Jewish life, you could find in many places, even outside of Eretz Yisrael. But Kahal Yisrael, only in Eretz Yisrael. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Says the Gemara. Pshita, well, this is a very interesting case here. So Pshita, Merubin ben Ismatu, Hainu Plugta de Rabbi Shimon Rabbanon. Again, a lot more to say, by the way, on that Kahal Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael, but absolutely no time. So Amir Hashem will come back to it. So Merubin ben Ismatu. Also, listen to this. So this is a very interesting case. Let's say at the time that Klal Yisrael sinned, it was a majority, but by the time we get around to going ahead and doing the Karban, it's a minority. So how does this happen? Rashi says, people died. So now there's no longer a numerical majority. In other words, the number is not the same. Rashi says, Pshita, Merume v'nismatu, Kagon shahoru bezdin, v'asurov kala piem, v'nischayvu lahavi par, v'lo ispiku lahavi ad shenismatu shemesu miktasan. It's a very interesting case over here. At the time when Bezdin paskined, and the people committed the Aveira, there was a majority. Now, at the time of the actual bringing of the Karban, it's a minority. People died. So what's the halacha? So Pshita, Merubin v'nismatu, Hainu plugter b'shem Rabbanon. It's machlokes. That's machlokes b'shem the Rabbanon. Mu'atan v'nisrabu. What happens? We'll say the opposite. Bezdin paskin. Ultimately, again, a minority sin. But now, when we get to ultimately, again, the Psak Halacha, it's a majority. So the Gemara says, what happens there? Mai, keep ligi Rabbi Shimon Rabbanon, Rabbi Shimon da'azal basi yediyah, mechayev, Rabbanon da'azli basar chata pachish. So we'll say, interestingly enough, the fundamental machlokes is, when do we establish liability? Is it ultimately, again, what we call basar yediyah, at the moment of awareness, or is it basar chata, ultimately, again, at the time of the bringing of the Karban itself? Or I should say, Basar Chata really means the Avera. Basar Yediyah means the moment, ultimately, again, that we have an awareness of culpability. When do we establish majority? The Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon is not just going basar chata, he even goes basar yediyah. Heichi the havi yediyah v'chata b'chiyov yediyah delo b'chata mishamis. Like maybe according to Rabbi Shimon, you need both yediyah and chata, where there's just yediyah awareness, but ultimately again not in a majority by the actual commission of the chait. Who would say that there's liability? The im came leisiki hashta. Rabbi Shimon chata v'yediyah boy. Rabbi Shimon requires both majority, both at the time of yediyah and chata. Okay, interesting. By the way, next case. Horu based in chelev, mutter, va'asu miut hakal. Boss, listen to this. Bezdin came along and paskin, chelev is mutter. Okay, then what ended up happening? A minority of Klal Yisrael acted on the psak. Fine. Then what happened? Bezdin realized their mistake, and ultimately again retracted the psak. Rabbi said, then what happened? The chazru Bezdin bahen vahoru. Then Bezdin paskined again. Chelev is mutter. Right? Rabbi said, you say to yourself, that's so crazy. How can you make the same mistake twice? And what's the answer? Look in the mirror. How can you make the same mistake twice? Life is filled with most of us making the same mistake twice or 222 times, right? Most of life is not making new mistakes. Most of life is actually just repeating the same mistakes over and over and over. One of the most frustrating things that often we encounter in the tshuva process is the inability to right ourselves and the inability to kind of get the reins on the same stuff. I mentioned this a number of times already. When we come to Yom Nora and we do tshuva, because I think for many of us, it's not the pshat that we say al chet and we're like, look at this. I was a mechadish this year. I never did this avera before. This is incredible, right? I'm diversifying, spiritually diversifying, right? I did new averas. Most of us, interestingly enough, do not come to Yom Noram with new chatam. Most times, what do we come with? The same chatam, same averas, and it's the same averas that I've been doing for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. It's the same stuff because change is hard. Change is incredibly difficult. So don't be so surprised that a Beis Din issues the same erroneous psak more than once. We make the same mistake more than once throughout our journey of life. So in any event, so Beis Din, so again, part one, Beis Din paskin chelev is mutter. A minority of Klal Yisrael acted on that. Then what happened? Beis Din paskin again, chelev is mutter. And I will say, what happens? Va'asu miut achar mahu. I will say, now watch this. Now what's the shaila? Do these two minorities combine to form a majority, therefore triggering the obligation of par helam davar min hatzibur? It's great kasha, right? So do that. Now remember, two individual minorities, both acting on the psak of the same Beis Din, both with the same avera of chelev, but two different piskei halacha. Do they combine to form a majority or not? So kevan d'shtei yediyos ninu lo mitzaref. On one hand, it was two different times of awareness, therefore they shouldn't combine. O dilma kevan d'idi v'idi chelev hu mitzaref. Or maybe because they're both chelev, they should combine. V'imtim salomar kevan d'idi v'idi chelev hu mitzaref. Miut b'chelev shal hakeva or miut b'chelev shal gabe dakin mahu. Okay, so let's say you would say that two instances of chelev do combine. What happens if it was two types of chelev? The first time Beis Din paskin that chelev on the stomach was mutter, and the second time they said chelev on the kidneys are aser. So two different types of chelev, erroneous chelev, piskei halacha, combined. So the Gemara says, "Hacha vadai kevan de betray cry kas." Or we can say, listen, even though they're both called chelev, they're two different types of chelev, therefore they don't combine. Oh dilma kevan de idi v'idi chelevu mitzaref. Or maybe no, since they're both chelev, they should combine. Tim salomer shem chelevu mitzaref. Miut b'chelev or miut b'dam mahu. What happens, Rabbi say? Beis Din first paskin chelev was mutter. A majority of Klal Yisrael ate chelev. Then they retracted that psak. Then they paskin blood is mutter, and a miut of Klal Yisrael went ahead and ate blood. Do those two minorities combine to form a majority for par helam davar min hatzibur? On one hand, we could say hacha vadai kevan de trei isurin inu the kevan din isurin shava lo mitzaref. On one hand, we could say, look, it's two different prohibitions. Right? It's two different prohibitions, and ultimately, again, the surim are not the same. For example, again, Abosai, chelev doesn't apply. There's not an isur chelev, let's say, by a chaya. So the isurim are not the same. O dilma, kevan the isurin shava, the karbanan shava, mitzaref. On one hand, there is similar, right, or the same carbonic liability, perhaps that should create a majority. Vimtim salamar kevan the isurin shava. To karbanan shava, maybe since there's both same carbonic liability, right? Because they both b'chai v'chatos, ultimately they can combine. What about miut b'chelev or miut b'avodas kochavim? What happens if the Beis Din paskin, you could eat chaylev, minority ate chaylev, then Beis Din paskin, avodah zarah is mutter. We'll say, do not go to this Beis Din. Do not go to this Beis Din, right? A minority ultimately, again, then they said that avodah zarah is mutter, and a minority did that. Can that combine to form a majority? There, both say the Isser is different, right? Obviously, and the carbonic liability is different. O Dilma, Kevan the Edi Karesu Mistai. On the other hand, both of them are kares, and therefore they should combine. What does the Gemara answer? Teku. Right? The Gemara says ultimately again, Teku. So the Gemara leaves this question open. Ibailahu, Hora Beis Din Shechele Mutter, Va'asimiot Hakal Umeis. We'll say, watch this. Watch this. What happens in the following case? Beis Din paskin that chaylev is mutter, right? And then what happened? A minority of the kehila, minority of Klal Yisrael, went ahead and ate. And what happens? Umeis osa Beis Din. And then the Beis Din died. Members of the Beis Din died. Okay. Now what happened? Va'amad Beis Din acher v'chazru v'horu v'asu miyat acher. Another Beis Din came along. They also paskin chaylev is mutter, and as a result, another minority of Klal Yisrael ate chaylev. So we'll say, what's that? So now, what's the shaila? So the Gemara says, do those two minorities combine together to form a majority? So the Gemara says, aliba demanda amar Beis Din ma'isi lo tibaylecha daha lesnu. So we'll say, so obviously, according to the opinion that says that Beis Din are the one who brings the par halam davar min hatzibor. So of course, again, there's not going to be any liability because the first Beis Din is dead. It has to be the same Beis Din. So the Gemara says, elakiti baylecha aliba demanda amar tzibor ma'isi. What's the shaila? Is according to the opinion that says that it's the tzibor that brings it. So what's the halacha? My tzibor hakai. It's the same tzibor. Interesting, it's the same tzibor. They acted erroneously under two different but they didn't. But it's the same tzibor. Therefore, they should bring it amad beis. Oh, thank you. Okay. All right. Oh Dilma. Yedia. Most I think about it like this. If the cycle was 8 years, I'd be ahead. Just gonna think about it. All right. Oh Dilma. Yediadahu Beis Din dehoru ba'inante. Or on the other hand, no. I need the same Beis Din. Right? Even though it's not the Beis Din that's bringing ultimately again the carbon, I still need the idea of that same Beis Din, and that's lacking. So what's the halacha bosai? To which the Gemara answers again, Teku. All right, bosai. We'll stop over here for today. Shkoyach, absolutely incredible. We are good. The truth is, all kidding aside, already by Shabbos, the dapim actually get. If you notice, the print gets bigger. Right? The pages get a little bit shorter. We'll be fine. All right, Chevron, have a great day, everyone.
Rob is going to put it on 2 speed.
We'll be fine. I could do that. I'll maybe leave it before Shabbos also. We'll see. I have to look first. Look at tomorrow's dap. See how difficult it is.